The Dragon capsule took SpaceX 4 years to design. It's likely the fastest project of its ilk done in the history of the aerospace industry. The project started with Musk and a handful of engineers, most of them under 30 years old, and peaked at 100 people. Asterisk they cribbed from past capsule work and read over every paper published by NASA and other aeronautics bodies around projects like Gemini and Apollo. If you go search for something like Apollo's re-entry guidance algorithm, there are these great databases that will just spit out the answer, Davis said. The engineers at SpaceX then had to figure out how to advance these past efforts and bring the capsule into the modern age. Some of the areas of improvement were obvious and easily accomplished, while others required more ingenuity. Saturn V and Apollo had colossal computing bases that produced only a fraction of the computer horsepower that can be achieved today on, say, an iPad. The SpaceX engineers knew they could save a lot of room by cutting out some of the computers while also adding capabilities with their more powerful equipment. The engineers decided that while Dragon would look a lot like Apollo, it would have steeper wall angles to clear space for gear and for the astronauts that the company hoped to fly. SpaceX also got the recipe for its heat shield material, called Pica, through a deal with NASA. The SpaceX engineers found out how to make the Pica material less expensively and improved the underlying recipe so that Dragon, from day one, could withstand the heat of a re-entry coming back from Mars. Asterisk the total cost for Dragon came in at $300 million, which would be on the order of 10 to 30 times less than capsule projects built by other companies. The metal comes in, we roll it out, weld it, and make things, Davis said. We build almost everything in-house. That is why the costs have come down. Davis, like Brogan and plenty of other SpaceX engineers, has had Musk ask for the seemingly impossible. His favorite request dates back to 2004. SpaceX needed an actuator that would trigger the gimbal action used to steer the upper stage of Falcon 1. Davis had never built a piece of hardware before in his life and naturally went out to find some suppliers who could make an electromechanical actuator for him. He got a quote back for $120,000. Elon laughed, Davis said. He said, that part is no more complicated than a garage door opener. Your budget is $5,000. Go make it work. Davis spent 9 months building the actuator. At the end of the process, he toiled for 3 hours writing an email to Musk covering the pros and cons of the device. The email went into gory detail about how Davis had designed the part, why he had made various choices, and what its cost would be. As he pressed send, Davis felt anxiety surge through his body knowing that he'd given his all for almost a year to do something an engineer at another aerospace company would not even attempt. Musk rewarded all of this toil and angst with one of his standard responses. He wrote back, okay. The actuator Davis designed ended up costing $3,900 and flew with Falcon 1 into space. I put every ounce of intellectual capital I had into that email and 1 minute later got that simple response, Davis said. Everyone in the company was having that same experience. One of my favorite things about Elon is his ability to make enormous decisions very quickly. That is still how it works today. Kevin Watson can attest to that. He arrived at SpaceX in 2008 after spending 24 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Watson worked on a wide variety of projects at JPL, including building and testing computing systems that could withstand the harsh conditions of space. JPL would typically buy expensive, specially toughened computers, and this frustrated Watson. He daydreamed about ways to handcraft much cheaper, equally effective computers. While having his job interview with Musk, Watson learned that SpaceX needed just this type of thinking. Musk wanted the bulk of a rocket's computing systems to cost no more than $10,000. It was an insane figure by aerospace industry standards, where the avionics systems for a rocket typically cost well over $10 million. In traditional aerospace, it would cost you more than $10,000 just for the food at a meeting to discuss the cost of the avionics, Watson said. During the job interview, Watson promised Musk that he could do the improbable and deliver the $10,000 avionics system. He began working on making the computers for Dragon right after being hired. The first system was called Cuckoo, pronounced Cuckoo. This communications box would go inside the International Space Station and communicate back with Dragon. A number of people at NASA referred to the SpaceX engineers as the guys in the garage, and were cynical about the startup's ability to do much of anything, including building this type of machine. But SpaceX produced the communication computer in record time, and it ended up as the first system of its kind to pass NASA's protocol tests on the first try. NASA officials were forced to say "cuckoo" over and over again during meetings, a small act of defiance SpaceX had planned all along to torture NASA. As the months went on, Watson and other engineers built out the complete computing systems for Dragon and then adapted the technology for Falcon 9. The result was a fully redundant avionics platform that used a mix of off-the-shelf computing and products built in-house by SpaceX. It cost a bit more than $10,000 but came close to meeting Musk's goal. SpaceX reinvigorated Watson, who had become disenchanted with JPL's acceptance of wasteful spending and bureaucracy. Musk had to sign off on every expenditure over $10,000. It was his money that we were spending, and he was keeping an eye on it, as he damn well should, Watson said. He made sure nothing stupid was happening. Decisions were made quickly during weekly meetings, and the entire company bought into them. It was amazing how fast people would adapt to what came out of those meetings, Watson said. The entire ship could turn 90 degrees instantly. Lockheed Martin could never do anything like that, Watson continued. Elon is brilliant. He's involved in just about everything. He understands everything. If he asks you a question, you learn very quickly not to go give him a gut reaction. He wants answers that get down to the fundamental laws of physics. One thing he understands really well is the physics of the rockets. He understands that like nobody else. The stuff I have seen him do in his head is crazy. He can get in discussions about flying a satellite and whether we can make the right orbit and deliver Dragon at the same time and solve all these equations in real time. It's amazing to watch the amount of knowledge he has accumulated over the years. I don't want to be the person who ever has to compete with Elon. You might as well leave the business and find something else fun to do. He will outmaneuver you, outthink you, and out-execute you. One of Watson's top discoveries at SpaceX was the test bed on the third floor of the Hawthorne factory. SpaceX has test versions of all the hardware and electronics that go into a rocket laid out on metal tables. It has in effect replicated the innards of a rocket end-to-end in order to run thousands of flight simulations. Someone launches the rocket from a computer and then every piece of mechanical and computing hardware is monitored with sensors. An engineer can tell a valve to open, then check to see if it opened, how quickly it opened, and the level of current running to it. This testing apparatus lets SpaceX engineers practice ahead of launches and figure out how they would deal with all manner of anomalies. During the actual flights, SpaceX has people in the test facility who can replicate errors seen on Falcon or Dragon and make adjustments accordingly. SpaceX has made numerous changes on the fly with this system. In one case, someone spotted an error in a software file in the hours right before launch. SpaceX's engineers changed the file, checked how it affected the test hardware, and, when no problems were detected, sent the file to the Falcon 9, waiting on the launch pad, all in less than 30 minutes. NASA wasn't used to this, Watson said. If something went wrong with the shuttle, everyone was just resigned to waiting 3 weeks before they could try and launch again. 12. From time to time, Musk will send out an email to the entire company to enforce a new policy or let them know about something that's bothering him. One of the more famous emails arrived in May 2010. With the subject line, "Acronyms seriously suck." There is a creeping tendency to use made-up acronyms at SpaceX. Excessive use of made-up acronyms is a significant impediment to communication, and keeping communication good as we grow is incredibly important. Individually, a few acronyms here and there may not seem so bad. But if 1,000 people are making these up, over time the result will be a huge glossary that we have to issue to new employees. No one can actually remember all these acronyms and people don't want to seem dumb in a meeting, so they just sit there in ignorance. This is particularly tough on new employees. That needs to stop immediately or I will take drastic action. I have given enough warnings over the years. Unless an acronym is approved by me, it should not enter the SpaceX glossary. If there is an existing acronym that cannot reasonably be justified, it should be eliminated, as I have requested in the past. For example, there should be no HTS, horizontal test stand, or VTS, vertical test stand designations for test stands. Those are particularly dumb, as they contain unnecessary words. A stand at our test site is obviously a test stand. VTS3 is 4 syllables compared with tripod, which is 2, so the bloody acronym version actually takes longer to say than the name. The key test for an acronym is to ask whether it helps or hurts communication. An acronym that most engineers outside of SpaceX already know, such as GI, is fine to use. It is also okay to make up a few acronyms, contractions every now and again, assuming I have approved them, e.g. MVAC. An M9 instead of Merlin 1C vacuum or Merlin 1C sea level, but those need to be kept to a minimum. This was classic Musk. The email is rough in its tone and yet not really unwarranted for a guy who just wants things done as efficiently as possible. It obsesses over something that other people might find trivial and yet he has a definite point. It's comical in that Musk wants all acronym approvals to run directly through him, but that's entirely in keeping with the hands-on management style that has, mainly, worked well at both SpaceX and Tesla. Employees have since dubbed the acronym policy the AS rule. The guiding principle at SpaceX is to embrace your work and get stuff done. People who await guidance or detailed instructions languish. The same goes for workers who crave feedback. And the absolute worst thing that someone can do is inform Musk that what he's asking is impossible. An employee could be telling Musk that there's no way to get the cost on something like that actuator down to where he wants it, or that there is simply not enough time to build a part by Musk's deadline. Elon will say, "Fine, you are off the project, and I am now the CEO of the project. I will do your job and be CEO of 2 companies at the same time. I will deliver it," Brogan said. What's crazy is that Elon actually does it. Every time he's fired someone and taken their job, he's delivered on whatever the project was. It is jarring for both parties when the SpaceX culture rubs against more bureaucratic bodies like NASA, the US Air Force, and the Federal Aviation Administration. The first inklings of these difficulties appeared on Quaj, where government officials sometimes questioned what they saw as SpaceX's cavalier approach to the launch process. There were times when SpaceX would want to make a change to its launch procedures, and any such change would require a pile of paperwork. SpaceX, for example, would have written down all the steps needed to replace a filter, put on gloves, wear safety goggles, remove a nut, and then want to alter this procedure or use a different type of filter. The FAA would need a week to review the new process before SpaceX could actually go about changing the filter on the rocket, a lag that both the engineers and Musk found ridiculous. On one occasion after this type of thing happened, Musk laid into an FAA official while on a conference call with members of the SpaceX team and NASA. It got hot and heated, and he berated this guy on a personal level for like 10 minutes. Brogan said. Musk did not recall this incident but did remember other confrontations with the FAA. One time he compiled a list of things an FAA subordinate had said during a meeting that Musk found silly and sent the list along to the guy's boss. And then his dingbat manager sent me this long email about how he had been in the shuttle program and in charge of 20 launches or something like that, and how dare I say that the other guy was wrong, Musk said. I told him, not only is he wrong, and let me re-articulate the reasons, but you're wrong, and let me articulate the reasons. I don't think he sent me another email after that. We're trying to have a really big impact on the space industry. If the rules are such that you can't make progress, then you have to fight the rules. There is a fundamental problem with regulators. If a regulator agrees to change a rule and something bad happens, they could easily lose their career. Whereas if they change a rule and something good happens, they don't even get a reward. So, it's very asymmetric. It's then very easy to understand why Regulators resist changing the rules. It's because there's a big punishment on one side and no reward on the other. How would any rational person behave in such a scenario? In the middle of 2009, SpaceX hired Ken Bowersox, a former astronaut, as its vice president of astronaut safety and mission assurance. Bowersox fit the mold of recruit prized by a classic big aerospace company. He had a degree in aerospace engineering from the US Naval Academy, had been a test pilot in the Air Force, and flew on the space shuttle a handful of times. Many people within SpaceX saw his arrival at the company as a good thing. He was considered a diligent, dignified sort who would provide a second set of eyes to many of SpaceX's procedures, checking to make sure the company went about things in a safe, standardized manner. Bowersox ended up smack in the middle of the constant pull and push at SpaceX between doing things efficiently and agonizing over traditional procedures. He and Musk were increasingly at odds as the months passed, and Bowersox started to feel as if his opinions were being ignored. During one incident in particular, a part made it all the way to the test stand with a major flaw, described by one engineer as the equivalent of a coffee cup not having a bottom, instead of being caught at the factory. According to observers, Bowersox argued that SpaceX should go back and investigate the process that led to the mistake and fix its root cause. Musk had already decided that he knew the basis of the problem and dismissed Bowersox after a couple of years on the job. Bowersox declined to speak on the record about his time at SpaceX. A number of people inside SpaceX saw the Bowersox incident as an example of Musk's hard-charging manner undermining some much-needed process. Musk had a totally different take on the situation, casting Bowersox as not being up to the engineering demands at SpaceX. A handful of high-ranking government officials gave me their candid takes on Musk, albeit without being willing to put their names to the remarks. One found Musk's treatment of Air Force generals and military men of similar rank appalling. Musk has been known to let even high-ranking officials have it when he thinks they're off base and is not apologetic about this. Another could not believe it when Musk would call very intelligent people idiots. Imagine the worst possible way that could come out, and it would come out, this person said. Life with Elon is like being in a very intimate married couple. He can be so gentle and loyal and then really hard on people when it isn't necessary. One former official felt that Musk would need to temper himself better in the years to come if SpaceX was to keep currying favor with the military and government agencies in its bid to defeat the incumbent contractors. His biggest enemy will be himself in the way he treats people, this person said. When Musk rubs outsiders the wrong way, Shotwell is often there to try to smooth over the situation. Like Musk, she has a salty tongue and a fiery personality, but Shotwell is willing to play the role of the conciliator. These skills have allowed her to handle the day-to-day operations at SpaceX, leaving Musk to focus on the company's overall strategy, the product designs, marketing, and motivating employees. Like all of Musk's most trusted lieutenants, Shotwell has been willing to stay largely in the background, do her work, and focus on the company's cause. Shotwell grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, the daughter of an artist, mom, and a neurosurgeon, dad. She played the part of a bright, pretty girl, getting straight A's at school and joining the cheerleading squad. Shotwell had not expressed a major inclination toward the sciences and knew only one version of an engineer, the guy who drives a train. But there were clues that she was wired a bit different. She was the daughter who mowed the lawn and helped put the family basketball hoop together. In third grade, Shotwell developed a brief interest in car engines, and her mom bought a book detailing how they work. Later, in high school, Shotwell's mom forced her to attend a lecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology on a Saturday afternoon. As Shotwell listened to one of the panels, she grew enamored with a 50-year-old mechanical engineer. She had these beautiful clothes, the suit and shoes that I loved, Shotwell said. She was tall and carried off the heels really well. Shotwell chatted with the engineer after the talk, learning about her job. That was the day I decided to become a mechanical engineer, she said. Shotwell went on to receive an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in applied mathematics from Northwestern University. Then she took a job at Chrysler. It was a type of Management training program meant for hotshot recent graduates who appeared to have leadership potential. Shotwell started out going to auto mechanics school. I loved that, and then from department to department. While working on engines research, Shotwell found that there were two very expensive Cray supercomputers sitting idle because none of the veterans knew how to use them. A short while later, she logged onto the computers and set them up to run computational fluid dynamics, or CFD, operations to simulate the performance of valves and other components. The work kept Shotwell interested, but the environment started to grate on her. There were rules for everything, including lots of union regulations around who could operate certain machines. I picked up a tool once, and got written up, she said. Then, I opened a bottle of liquid nitrogen and got written up. I started thinking that the job was not what I had anticipated it would be. Shotwell pulled out of the Chrysler training program, regrouped at home, and then briefly pursued her doctorate in applied mathematics. While back on the Northwestern campus, one of her professors mentioned an opportunity at the Aerospace Corporation. Anything but a household name, Aerospace Corporation has been headquartered in El Segundo since 1960, serving as a kind of neutral, non-profit organization that advises the Air Force, NASA, and other federal bodies on space programs. The company has a bureaucratic feel but has proved very useful over the years with its research activities and ability to champion and nix costly endeavors. Shotwell started at Aerospace in October 1988 and worked on a wide range of projects. One job required her to develop a thermal model that depicted how temperature fluctuations in the Space Shuttle's cargo bay affected the performance of equipment on various payloads. She spent 10 years at Aerospace and honed her skills as a systems engineer. By the end, though, Shotwell had become irritated by the pace of the industry. I didn't understand why it had to take 15 years to make a military satellite, she said. You could see my interest was waning. For the next 4 years, Shotwell worked at Microcosm, a space startup just down the road from the Aerospace Corporation, and became the head of its Space Systems Division and Business Development. Boasting a combination of smarts, confidence, direct talk, and good looks, Shotwell developed a reputation as a strong saleswoman. In 2002, one of her co-workers, Hans Koenigsmann, left for SpaceX. Shotwell took Koenigsmann out for a going-away lunch and dropped him off at SpaceX's then rinky-dink headquarters. Hans told me to go in and meet Elon, Shotwell said. I did, and that's when I told him, you need a good business development person. The next day Mary Beth Brown called Shotwell and told her that Musk wanted to interview her for the new Vice President of Business Development position. Shotwell ended up as employee number 7. I gave 3 weeks notice at Microcosm and remodeled my bathroom because I knew I would not have a life after taking the job, she said. Through the early years of SpaceX, Shotwell pulled off the miraculous feat of selling something the company did not have. It took SpaceX so much longer than it had planned to have a successful flight. The failures along the way were embarrassing and bad for business. Nonetheless, Shotwell managed to sell about a dozen flights to a mix of government and commercial customers before SpaceX put its first Falcon 1 into orbit. Her deal-making skills extended to negotiating the big-ticket contracts with NASA that kept SpaceX alive during its leanest years, including a $278 million contract in August 2006 to begin work on vehicles that could ferry supplies to the East. Shotwell's track record of success turned her into Musk's ultimate confidant at SpaceX, and at the end of 2008, she became president and chief operating officer at the company. Part of Shotwell's duties include reinforcing the SpaceX culture as the company grows larger and starts to resemble the traditional aerospace giants that it likes to mock. Shotwell can switch on an easygoing, affable air and address the entire company during a meeting or convince a collection of possible recruits why they should sign up to be worked to the bone. During one such meeting with a group of interns, Shotwell pulled about 100 people into the corner of the cafeteria. She wore high-heel, black boots, skin-tight jeans, a tan jacket, and a scarf and had big hoop earrings dangling beside her shoulder-length blonde hair. Pacing back and forth in front of the group with a microphone in hand, she Asked them to announce what school they came from and what project they were working on while at SpaceX. One student went to Cornell and worked on Dragon, another went to USC and did propulsion system design, and another went to the University of Illinois and worked with the aerodynamics group. It took about 30 minutes to make it all the way around the room, and the students were, at least by academic pedigree and bright-eyed enthusiasm, among the most impressive youngsters in the world. The students peppered Shotwell with questions, her best moment, her advice for being successful, space access, competitive threats, and she replied with a mix of earnest answers and rah-rah stuff. Shotwell made sure to emphasize the lean, innovative edge SpaceX has over the more traditional aerospace companies. Our competitors are scared shitless of us, Shotwell told the group. The behemoths are going to have to figure out how to get it together and compete. And it is our job to have them die. One of SpaceX's biggest goals, Shotwell said, was to fly as often as possible. The company has never sought to make a fortune off each flight. It would rather make a little on each launch and keep the flights flowing. A Falcon 9 flight cost $60 million, and the company would like to see that figure drop to about $20 million through economies of scale and improvements in launch technology. SpaceX spent $2.50 billion to get 4 Dragon capsules to the ISS, 9 flights with the Falcon 9, and 5 flights with the Falcon 1. It's a price per launch total that the rest of the players in the industry cannot comprehend, let alone aspire to. I don't know what those guys do with their money, Shotwell said. They are smoking it. I just don't know. As Shotwell saw it, a number of new nations were showing interest in launches. Eyeing communications technology is essential to growing their economies and leveling their status with developed nations. Cheaper flights would help SpaceX take the majority of the business from that new customer set. The company also expected to participate in an expanding market for human flights. SpaceX has never had any interest in doing the 5-minute tourist flights to low Earth orbit like Virgin Galactic and XCOR. It does, however, have the ability to carry researchers to orbiting habitats being built by Bigelow Aerospace and to orbiting science labs being constructed by various countries. SpaceX will also start making its own satellites, turning the company into a one-stop space shop. All of these plans hinge on SpaceX being able to prove that it can fly on schedule every month and churn through the $5 billion backlog of launches. Most of our customers signed up early and wanted to be supportive and got good deals on their missions, she said. We are in a phase now where we need to launch on time and make launching Dragons more efficient. For a short while, the conversation with the interns bogged down. It turned to some of the annoyances of SpaceX's campus. The company leases its facility and has not been able to build things like a massive parking structure that would make life easier for its 3,000-person workforce. Shotwell promised that more parking, more bathrooms, and more of the freebies that technology startups in Silicon Valley offer their employees would be on the way. I want a daycare, she said. But it was while discussing SpaceX's grandest missions that Shotwell really came into her own and seemed to inspire the interns. Some of them clearly dreamed of becoming astronauts, and Shotwell said that working at SpaceX was almost certainly their best chance to get to space now that NASA's astronaut corps had dwindled. Musk had made designing cool-looking, non-stay puffed spacesuits a personal priority. They can't be clunky and nasty, Shotwell said. You have to do better than that. As for where the astronauts would go, well, there were the space habitats, the moon, and, of course, Mars as options. SpaceX has already started testing a giant rocket, called the Falcon Heavy, that will take it much farther into space than the Falcon 9, and it has another, even larger spaceship on the way. Our Falcon Heavy rocket will not take a busload of people to Mars, she said. So, there's something after Heavy. We're working on it to make something like that vehicle happen, she said. The SpaceX employees needed to be effective and pushy. Make sure your output is high, Shotwell said. If we're throwing a bunch of shit in your way, you need to be mouthy about it. That's not a quality that's widely accepted elsewhere, but it is at SpaceX. And, if that sounded harsh, so be it. As Shortwell saw it, the commercial space race was coming down to SpaceX and China, and that's it. And in the bigger picture, the race was on to ensure man's survival. If you hate people and think human extinction is okay, then fuck it, Shortwell said. Don't go to space. If you think it is worth humans doing some risk management and finding a second place to go live, then you should be focused on this issue and willing to spend some money. I am pretty sure we will be selected by NASA to drop landers and rovers off on Mars. Then the first SpaceX mission will be to drop off a bunch of supplies, so that once people get there, there will be places to live and food to eat and stuff for them to do. It's talk like this that thrills and amazes people in the aerospace industry, who have long been hoping that some company would come along and truly revolutionize space travel. Aeronautics experts will point out that 20 years after the Wright brothers started their experiments, air travel had become routine. The launch business, by contrast, appears to have frozen. We've been to the moon, sent research vehicles to Mars, and explored the solar system, but all of these things are still immensely expensive one-off projects. The cost remains extraordinarily high because of the rocket equation, said Carol Stoker, TE, planetary scientist at NASA. Thanks to military and government contracts from agencies like NASA, TE, aerospace industry has historically had massive budgets to work with and tried to make the biggest, most reliable machines it could. The business has been tuned to strive for maximum performance, so that TE aerospace contractors can say they met their requirements. That strategy makes sense if you are trying to send up a $1 billion military satellite for the US government and simply cannot afford for the payload to blow up. But on the whole, this approach stifles the pursuit of other endeavors. It leads to bloat and excess and a crippling of the commercial space industry. Outside of SpaceX, the American launch providers are no longer competitive against their peers in other countries. They have limited launch abilities and questionable ambition. SpaceX's main competitor for domestic military satellites and other large payloads is United Launch Alliance, ULA, a joint venture formed in 2006 when Boeing and Lockheed Martin combined forces. The thinking at the time about the union was that the government did not have enough business for two companies and that combining the research and manufacturing work of Boeing and Lockheed would result in cheaper, safer launches. ULA has leaned on decades of work around the Delta, Boeing, and Atlas, Lockheed, launch vehicles and has flown many dozens of rockets successfully, making it a model of reliability. But neither the joint venture, nor Boeing nor Lockheed, both of which can offer commercial services on their own, come close to competing on price against SpaceX, the Russians, or the Chinese. For the most part, the global commercial market is dominated by Arianespace, Europe, Long March, China, or Russian vehicles, said Dave Bearden, the general manager of civil and commercial programs at the Aerospace Corporation. There are just different labor rates and differences in the way they are built. To put things more bluntly, ULA has turned into an embarrassment for the United States. In March 2014, ULA's then CEO, Michael Gass, faced off against Musk during a congressional hearing that dealt, in part, with SpaceX's request to take on more of the government's annual launch load. A series of slides were rolled out that showed how the government payments for launches have skyrocketed since Boeing and Lockheed went from a duopoly to a monopoly. According to Musk's math presented at the hearing, ULA charged $380 million per flight, while SpaceX would charge $90 million per flight. The $90 million figure was higher than SpaceX's standard $60 million because the government has certain additional requirements for particularly sensitive launches. By simply picking SpaceX as its launch provider, Musk pointed out, the government would save enough money to pay for the satellite going on the rocket. Gass had no real retort. He claimed Musk's figures for the ULA launch price were inaccurate but failed to provide a figure of his own. The hearing also came as tensions between the United States and Russia were running high due to Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine. Musk rightly noted that the United States could soon be placing sanctions on Russia that could carry over to aerospace equipment. ULA, as it happens, relies on Russian-made engines to send up sensitive US military equipment in its Atlas V Rockets. Our Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launch vehicles are truly American, Musk said. We design and manufacture our rockets in California and Texas. Gas counted that Uller had bought a 2-year supply of Russian engines and purchased the blueprints to the machines and had them translated from Russian to English, and he said this with a straight face. A few months after the hearing, Uller replaced Gas as CEO and signed a deal with Blue Origin to develop American-made rockets. Some of the most disheartening moments of the hearing arrived when Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama took the microphone for questioning. Uller has manufacturing facilities in Alabama and close ties to the senator. Shelby felt compelled to play the role of hometown booster by repeatedly pointing out that Uller had enjoyed 68 successful launches and then asking Musk what he made of that accomplishment. The aerospace industry stands as one of Shelby's biggest donors, and he's ended up surprisingly pro-bureaucracy and anti-competition when it comes to getting things into space. Typically, competition results in better quality and lower-priced contracts, but the launch market is not typical. Shelby said, it is limited demand framed by government industrial policies. The March hearing in which Shelby made these statements would turn out to be something of a sham. The government had agreed to put 14 of its sensitive launches up for bid instead of just awarding them directly to Uller. Musk had come to Congress to present his case for why SpaceX made sense as a viable candidate for those and other launches. The day after the hearing, the Air Force cut the number of launches up for bid from 14 to between 7 and 1. 1 month later, SpaceX filed a lawsuit against the Air Force, asking for a chance to earn its launch business. SpaceX is not seeking to be awarded contracts for these launches, the company said on its freedomtolaunch.com website. We are simply seeking the right to compete. Asterisk. SpaceX's main competitor for its resupply missions and commercial satellites in the United States is Orbital Sciences Corporation. Founded in Virginia in 1982, the company started out not unlike SpaceX, as the new kid that raised outside funding and focused on putting smaller satellites into low Earth orbit. Orbital is more experienced, although it has a limited roster of machine types. Orbital depends on suppliers, including Russian and Ukrainian companies, for its engines and rocket bodies, making it more of an assembler of spacecraft than a true builder like SpaceX. And, also unlike SpaceX, Orbital's capsules cannot withstand the journey back from the Earth to Earth, so it's unable to return experiments and other goods. In October 2014, one of Orbital's rockets blew up on the launch pad. With its ability to launch on hold while it investigated the incident, Orbital reached out to SpaceX for help. It wanted to see if Musk had any extra capacity to take care of some of Orbital's customers. The company also signaled that it would move away from using Russian engines as well. As for getting humans to space, SpaceX and Boeing were the victors in a 4-year NASA competition to fly astronauts to the ISS. SpaceX will get $2.6 billion, and Boeing will get $4.2 billion to develop their capsules and ferry people to the ISS by 2017. The companies would, in effect, be replacing the space shuttle and restoring the United States' ability to conduct manned flights. I actually don't mind that. Boeing gets twice as much money for meeting the same NASA requirements as SpaceX with worse technology, Musk said. Having two companies involved is better for the advancement of human spaceflight. SpaceX had once looked like it too would be a one-trick pony. The company's original plans were to have the smallish Falcon 1 function as its primary workhorse. At $6 million to $12 million per flight, Falcon 1 was by far the cheapest means of getting something into orbit, thrilling people in the space industry. When Google announced its Lunar X Prize in 2007, $30 million in awards to people who could land a robot on the moon, many of the proposals that followed selected the Falcon 1 as their preferred launch vehicle because it seemed like the only reasonably priced option for getting something to the moon. Scientists around the world were equally excited, thinking that for the first time they had a means of placing experiments into orbit in a cost-effective way. But for all the enthusiastic talk about the Falcon 1, the demand never arrived. It became very clear that there was a huge need for the Falcon 1 but no money for it, said Shortwell. The market has to be able to sustain a certain amount of vehicles, and 3 Falcon once per year does not make a business. The last Falcon 1 launch took place in July 2009 from Kwajalein, when SpaceX carried a satellite into orbit for the Malaysian government. People in the aerospace industry have been grumbling ever since. We gave Falcon 1 a hell of a shot, Shortwell said. I was emotional about it and disappointed. I'd anticipated a flood of orders, but after 8 years, they just did not come. SpaceX has since expanded its launch capabilities at a remarkable pace and looks like it might be on the verge of getting the $12 million per flight option back. In June 2010, the Falcon 9 flew for the first time and orbited Earth successfully. In December 2010, SpaceX proved that the Falcon 9 could carry the Dragon capsule into space and that the capsule could be recovered safely after an ocean landing. It became the first commercial company ever to pull off this feat. Then, in May 2012, SpaceX went through the most significant moment in the company's history since that first successful launch on Kwajalein. On May 22, at 3:44 a.m., a Falcon 9 rocket took off from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. The rocket did its human-like work boosting Dragon into space. Then the capsule's solar panels fanned out and Dragon became dependent on its 18 Draco thrusters, or small rocket engines, to guide its path to the International Space Station. The SpaceX engineers worked in shifts, some of them sleeping on cots at the factory, as it took the capsule 3 days for Dragon to make its journey. They spent most of the time observing Dragon's flight and checking to see that its sensor systems were picking up the IS. Originally, Dragon planned to dock with the IS around 4 a.m. on the 25th, but as the capsule approached the space station, an unexpected glint kept throwing off the calculations of a laser used to measure the distance between Dragon and the IS. I remember it being 2.5 hours of struggle, Shortwell said. Her outfit of Uggs, a fishnet sweater, and leggings started to feel like pajamas as the night wore on, and the engineers battled this unplanned difficulty. Fearing all the time that the mission would be aborted, SpaceX decided to upload some new software to the Dragon that would cut the size of the visual frame used by the sensors to eliminate the effect of the sunlight on the machine. Then, just before 7 a.m., Dragon got close enough to the IS for Don Pettit, an astronaut, to use a 58-foot robotic arm to reach out and grab the resupply capsule. Houston, station, it looks like we've got us a Dragon by the tail, Pettit said. 13. I'd been digesting my guts, Shortwell said. And then I am drinking champagne at 6 in the morning. About 30 people were in the control room when the docking happened. Over the next couple of hours, workers streamed into the SpaceX factory to soak up the elation of the moment. SpaceX had set another first, as the only private company to dock with these. A couple of months later, SpaceX received $440 million from NASA to keep developing Dragon so that it could transport people. Elon is changing the way aerospace business is done, said NASA Stoker. He's managed to keep the safety factor up while cutting costs. He's just taken the best things from the tech industry, like the open flow of his plans and having everyone talking and all this human interaction. It's a very different way to most of the aerospace industry, which is designed to produce requirements documents and project reviews. In May 2014, Musk invited the press to SpaceX's headquarters to demonstrate what some of that NASA money had bought. He unveiled the Dragon V2, or version 2, spacecraft. Unlike most executives, who like to show their products off at trade shows or daytime events, Musk prefers to hold true Hollywood-style galas in the evenings. People arrived in Hawthorne by the hundreds and snacked on hors d'oeuvre until the 7:30 p.m. showing. Musk appeared wearing a purplish velvet jacket and popping open the capsule's door with a bump of his fist like the Fonz. What he revealed was spectacular. The cramped quarters of past capsules were gone. There were 7 thin, sturdy, contoured seats arranged, with 4 seats close to the main console and a row of 3 seats in the back. Musk walked around in the capsule to show how roomy it was and then plopped down in the central captain's chair. He reached up and unlocked a 4-panel flat-screen console that gracefully slid down right in front of the first row of seats. Asterisk in the middle of the console was a joystick for flying the aircraft and some physical buttons for essential functions that astronauts could press in case of an emergency or a malfunctioning touchscreen. The inside of the capsule had a bright, metallic finish. Someone had finally built a spaceship worthy of scientist and movie maker dreams. There was substance to go with the style. The Dragon 2 will be able to dock with these and other space habitats automatically without needing the intervention of a robotic arm. It will run on a Super Draco engine, a thruster made by SpaceX and the first engine ever built completely by a 3D printer to go into space. This means that a machine guided by a computer formed the engine out of single piece of metal, in this case the high-strength alloy Inconel, so that its strength and performance should exceed anything built by humans by welding various parts together. And most mind-boggling of all, Musk revealed that the Dragon 2 will be able to land anywhere on Earth that SpaceX wants by using the Super Draco engines and thrusters to come to a gentle stop on the ground. No more landings at sea. No more throwing spaceships away. That is how a 21st century spaceship should land, Musk said. You can just reload propellant and fly again. So long as we continue to throw away rockets and spacecraft, we will never have true access to space. The Dragon 2 is just one of the machines that SpaceX continues to develop in parallel. One of the company's next milestones will be the first flight of the Falcon Heavy, which is designed to be the world's most powerful rocket. Asterisk SpaceX has found a way to combine 3 Falcon 9s into a single craft. With 27 of the Merlin engines and the ability to carry more than 53 metric tons of stuff into orbit. Part of the genius of Musk and Mueller's designs is that SpaceX can reuse the same engine in different configurations, from the Falcon 1 up to the Falcon Heavy, saving on cost and time. We make our main combustion chambers, turbo pump, gas generators, injectors, and main valves, Mueller said. We have complete control. We have our own test site, while most of the other guys use government test sites. The labor hours are cut in half and so is the work around the materials. 4 years ago, we could make 2 rockets a year and now we can make 20 a year. SpaceX boasts that the Falcon Heavy can take up twice the payload of the nearest competitor, the Delta IV Heavy from Boeing, Uller, at 1/3 the cost. SpaceX is also busy building a spaceport from the ground up. The goal is to be able to launch many rockets an hour from this facility located in Brownsville, Texas, by automating the processes needed to stand a rocket up on the pad, fuel it, and send it off. Just as it did in the early days, SpaceX continues to experiment with these new vehicles during actual launches in ways that other companies would dare not do. SpaceX will often announce that it's trying out a new engine or its landing legs and place the emphasis on that one upgrade in the marketing material leading up to a launch. It's common, though, for SpaceX to test out a dozen other objectives in secret. During a mission, Musk essentially asks employees to do the impossible on top of the impossible. 1. Former SpaceX executive described the working atmosphere as a perpetual motion machine that runs on a weird mix of dissatisfaction and eternal hope. It's like he has everyone working on this car that is meant to get from Los Angeles to New York on one tank of gas, this executive said. They will work on the car for a year and test all of its parts. Then, when they set off for New York after that year, all of the vice presidents think privately that the car will be lucky to get to Las Vegas. What ends up happening is that the car gets to New Mexico, twice as far as they ever expected, and Elon is still mad. He gets twice as much as anyone else out of people. There's a degree to which it's just never enough for Musk, no matter what it is. Case in point, the December 2010 launch in which SpaceX got the Dragon capsule to orbit Earth and return successfully. This had been one of the company's great achievements, and people had worked tirelessly for months, if not years. The launch had taken place on December 8, and SpaceX had a Christmas party on December 16. About 90 minutes before the party started, Musk had called his top executives to SpaceX for a meeting. 6 of them, including Mueller, were decked out in party attire and ready to celebrate the holidays and SpaceX's historic achievement around Dragon. Musk laid into them for about an hour, because the trust structure for a future rocket was running behind schedule. Their wives were sitting 3 cubes over waiting for the berating to end, Brogan said. Other examples of similar behavior have cropped up from time to time. Musk, for example, rewarded a group of 30 employees who had pulled off a tough project for NASA with bonuses that consisted of additional stock option grants. Many of the employees, seeking instant, more tangible gratification, demanded cash. He chided us for not valuing the stock, Drew Eldine, a former engineer, said. He said, in the long run, this is worth a lot more than $1,000 in cash. He wasn't screaming or anything like that, but he seemed disappointed in us. It was hard to hear that. The lingering question for many SpaceX employees is when exactly they will see a big reward for all their work. SpaceX's staff is paid well but by no means exorbitantly. Many of them expect to make their money when SpaceX files for an initial public offering. The thing is that Musk does not want to go public anytime soon, and understandably so. It's a bit hard to explain the whole Mars thing to investors when it's unclear what the business model around starting a colony on another planet will be. When the employees heard Musk say that an IPO was years away and would not occur until the Mars mission looked more secure, they started to grumble, and when Musk found out, he addressed all of SpaceX in an email that is a fantastic window into his thinking and how it differs from almost every other CEO's. The full email appears in Appendix 3, June 7, 2013. Going public. Per my recent comments, I am increasingly concerned about SpaceX going public before the Mars transport system is in place. Creating the technology needed to establish life on Mars always has been the fundamental goal of SpaceX. If being a public company diminishes that likelihood, then we should not do so until Mars is secure. This is something that I am open to reconsidering, but, given my experiences with Tesla and SolarCity, I am hesitant to foist being public on SpaceX, especially given the long-term nature of our mission. Some at SpaceX who have not been through a public company experience may think that being public is desirable. This is not so. Public company stocks, particularly if big step changes in technology are involved, go through extreme volatility, both for reasons of internal execution and for reasons that have nothing to do with anything except the economy. This causes people to be distracted by the manic depressive nature of the stock instead of creating great products. For those who are under the impression that they are so clever that they can outsmart public market investors and would sell SpaceX stock at the right time, let me relieve you of any such notion. If you really are better than most hedge fund managers, then there is no need to worry about the value of your SpaceX stock, as you can just invest in other public company stocks and make billions of dollars in the market.